Hope you all enjoyed the light lunch outside.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is David Evans, who worked for the Australian Greenhouse Office, now the Department of Climate Change, from 1999 to 2005, modeling Australia's carbon in plants, debris, mulch, soils, and forestry, and agricultural products. Evans is a mathematician and engineer with 6 university degrees, including a PhD from Stanford University in electrical engineering. His wife, Joanne Nova, who will have a presentation closing our program today, runs a major skeptic blog, joannenova.com.au. The evidence supported the idea that carbon dioxide emissions were the main cause of global warming reversed itself from 1998 to 2006, causing Evans to move from being a warmist to a skeptic. Please welcome a great wit and a terrific scientist, David Evans.
Hi, I'm going to talk about some pretty simple aspects of science today, climate science. So I wanted to focus on how the warmists cheat. Do we have a pointing device? We don't, do we? Okay. We've got 2 screens.
I know, you just have to pick one.
See how Okay, in that yellow circle is an official thermometer. These are one of the thermometers used to record the official temperature in the United States. And as you can see, it's not well positioned. Can anyone see any problems with that? I went through all the sources of heat that are nearby and drew big red arrows. There's an air conditioner down in the lower right. There's concrete, obviously reflecting heat. There's a brick wall. Those grates there cover effluent, which is fairly warm, and you can see the steam rising off it in winter. And there's a refrigeration unit over to the left. And a couple of windbreaks, all of which act to pump up the temperature a little bit, recorded by that thermometer. Here's another thermometer. Can you see any problems with this one? There's another air conditioning unit nearby. There's a windbreak. There are car engines that are frequently nearby, so cars come and park nearby there and heat the thermometer up. You can see a much better sight across the driveway on the lawn behind. It's further away from the air conditioner and the cars and the walls and all the rest of it, but they don't use that. They use the one just near the air conditioner. So here's the question. Why? Global warming is alleged to be occurring at the rate of tenths of a degree per century. So any slight artificial nudge matters. The official siting requirements are that a thermometer has to be 30 metres from an artificial source of heat, and that includes radiant heat. So concrete gives off radiant heat. It should be in a level, open clearing, that means no shade, with typical ground cover. That means typical of the natural environment, not the urban environment. So typically grass or snow or rock or whatever is typical of that region. And here's the point that Anthony Watt discovered. 89% of the 860 thermometers he's got a bunch of volunteers to survey, 89% of them are too close to an artificial heating source. Here's another example. This is an iconic example from Marysville in California. There's the thermometer in the middle, and there's 2 big air conditioning units to the right. There's a bit of asphalt, a bit of concrete, there's car engines, there's windbreaks. And taken from the other side, there's a big steel tower that reflects heat directly onto it. Why do they measure temperatures like this? What motive could there be? Why have we only found out about it because a bunch of volunteers went out and photographed the official thermometers? The climate science establishment didn't tell us that there was a problem, and the media didn't tell us there was a problem. Money is not the issue. NOAA, the group in the United States who run that network of 1,000 thermometers, has a budget of over $4 billion US per year. Another problem, wastewater, effluent, sewage, whatever you want to call it. It's warm, there's decomposing organic matter in there, it gives off heat. Just to demonstrate that, here's some tanks in Washington, in the state of Washington. in snow. Notice how there's no snow around the tanks. And there's an infrared photo of the same to the right. Notice how the wastewater is warm. Wouldn't that be a good place to put an official thermometer? This isn't the same tank, this is at a different wastewater treatment plant, but there are a lot of official thermometers at wastewater treatment plants. This one here gets a bit from the concrete and a bit of a steel post nearby, but there's a stream of effluent, what's that, 10 metres away, maybe 15? Check out this one in Florida. How's that for a level, open clearing with ground cover typical of the region? You don't know it, but there's another wastewater tank just like that one, just behind the camera, and there's an air conditioning unit tucked away, operating all the time, just beyond that shelf and just down and to the left. Why haven't the media covered it? I'm sure most of you in this room have seen those photographs before without the red marker on Anthony Watts' site. But have you ever seen them in a newspaper? On Late One? Is the media failing to do its job? Another example from the United States, this is in Baltimore on the East Coast. This shows the graphic with this problem of urban heat. There's a thermometer parked up on the roof of the Customs House, which is about a 3 or 4 story building. Notice they put it on the part of the roof next to the air conditioner. I mean, they could have put it further away, but they didn't. There's urban heat coming in. As Baltimore grew, that thermometer station recorded an increase in heat due to the surrounding cars, factories, etc. You get an urban heat island with any microclimate around a thermometer when it changes due to typical sort of urban accoutrements. In a city of 1 million people, that sort of urban heat island effect is typically 1 to 3 degrees on average. But in an evening, it can be up to 12 degrees warmer. So this is a pretty big artificial nudge. Remember, global warming, 1/10 of a degree per century, and they're sticking thermometers next to air conditioners. Now, Senator Bernardi talked about making simple messages about the science that people can understand. I think the idea of a thermometer near an air conditioner pretty much shows that they're cheating. I think if everyone in the world had seen those images I just showed you, that would detract considerably from the credibility of the climate science establishment. So, this paper will be going up on the web soon. I invite all of you to cut out those photographs, make little emails and send them to everyone. Because if the press won't publish it, we have to use email and send it to all your friends, all your journalists, all your contacts. Here's an example from Sydney. This is the Sydney Observatory in 1874. Note the lack of freeways. Note also the thermometer parked at the front. You can't see, it's too small, but there is an official thermometer for observatory in Sydney outside that building. The population of Sydney when it was first went in was about 60,000 people. There it is today. There's a bloody great freeway next to it. There's urban heat coming in from all directions. There's asphalt around it. There are also a global network of thermometers. The global network is probably more important. It consists of about 1,000 thermometers nowadays, but over half of them are at airports. What's special about airports? Well, they tend to be fairly warm places. Tarmac raises the heat level recorded by those thermometers. Tarmac radiates heat, particularly at night. It absorbs energy during the day and radiates it back at night, which raises the minimum temperature recorded by a thermometer, and thus the average temperature. Thermometers pop the occasional blast of jet exhaust. They all do with thermometers. Airports. The warmists like to claim that their land thermometer networks are independent, but they're not. They all use the same global network as their main source of information. They add a couple of other thermometers themselves and they process the data differently than their computers, but essentially they all use this official network of thermometers. Here's Rome Airport. That thermometer is at the centre of the red arrows. There's a bit of asphalt nearby, and there's a car parking station across the road, which is probably less than 30 metres away, so that's not too good. But there's a whole lot of tarmac that looks like it's about 20 metres away, and there are 4 parking slots for planes that use jet engines to drive themselves around. This one's a worse example. It's not as obvious. This is in a small island in the northern part of Norway, but that airport has about 150,000 passengers per year. There are mid-sized jet aircraft coming into that airport daily. The thermometer is next to the tarmac, but the tarmac is the warmest spot around because it's kept free of ice and snow. And there are de-icing machines that go around there regularly, and the thermometer also gets sprays from the jet aircraft. So why not just put it off in the snow somewhere? Why does it have to be next to the tarmac? These people aren't even trying. Or if they are trying, they're not trying to be honest. So what are they measuring? If 80% of the official global thermometers are either at airports or in urban areas, they've been placed to measure the growth and use of cities. Air conditioners, planes, water treatment plants, cars, buses, trucks, asphalt, concrete and tarmac. They are measuring temperatures at the globe's warmest localities, not global temperatures. This is a small slip of the tongue that people outside the Western Climate Establishment may not have noticed. They are measuring urban warming and airport warming, not global warming. How have they been able to get away with this? Where are the regulators and auditors? Who's ever heard of the word regulator in the same context as climate science? You never think of regulators with climate science. What about auditors? Any financial organisation had auditors. These people have a huge budget and they're telling the world's economy what to do, and they are not audited. Drug companies, financial institutions would be busted if they tried this sort of stuff. That's just one of the tricks. I'll just quickly whiz through four more they do. After they take the raw temperatures from those carefully positioned thermometers, they adjust them upwards. Almost the entire warming for the United States, for instance, from the 1930s through the 1990s, is entirely due to the adjustments. That is, the raw data from the 1930s is just as high in the United States in the 1930s as it is in the 1990s. They also practice revisionism. They change the temperatures, official temperatures at GISS and so on after about a decade, so it always looks like the last decade was warming really fast. The 1970s had several different temperatures in the last 20 or 30 years according to GISS. There used to be a lot more thermometers. A lot of them just stopped being used. It went from 6,000 to about 1,000 in the last 20 years. The ones that were removed have increased the proportion of thermometers at airports, near the equator, and not in the mountains. All three of those tendencies tend to get you warmer temperatures, high temperatures. They hide what they're doing. They evade freedom of information requests. They even famously claim to have lost the original data. Why? If their case and their data were so strong, why would they be playing these games? More importantly, from a political aspect, if most people knew about this, what conclusion would they draw? What difference do all those games make? When the global climate establishment wants to tell you the temperature record for the last 30 years or so, this is the graph they usually produce, give or take. This is from GISS, the Goddard Institute of Space Studies. It's almost entirely based on land thermometers, and it's the most tricked up record they have. And what it basically shows is that the warmest year was 2006, and that the warming trend continues. You run your eye along there and you go, yep, it's warming. We're all going to fry. We have another method of measuring temperatures. Satellites go around the world constantly. They measure the whole world except near the poles. There were some initial calibration problems that have been fixed decades ago. It's the most reliable, extensive and unbiased method we have. Here's what the satellites say. They give a politically significant different answer. They say the warmest year was 98. The warming trend went to about 2001, somewhere around there it levelled off. There was a large El Niño spike in 1998. There's another one in 2010, which we're going through now. It peaked in March and temperatures are coming down again. Not so bad. Maybe this global warming is paused. Dr. Phil Jones, in February this year, who's head of the Climate Research Unit at the University of East Anglia in the UK, which is probably the third ranking climate institute in the Western Climate Establishment, said in a BBC interview, from 1995 to the present, there has been no statistically significant global warming. So put on the spot, they'll admit it. He also agreed that there'd been cooling since 2002, but qualified that by saying the period was too short to be statistically significant. That's air temperatures. Let's move on to ocean temperatures. Ocean temperatures are very important because most of the heat in the climate system resides in the ocean. Now that air temperatures have turned against the establishment, they've increasingly turned to giving you ocean heat content figures or ocean temperature figures. However, until the Argo program started in 2003, all of the data is essentially rubbish. They do it by firing sort of harpoon-like things called XBTs off ships. The harpoon goes down a few hundred metres into the water and they wire back the temperature. It's a very imprecise and inaccurate measure, and it only sampled water on commercial shipping lanes, mainly in the Northern Hemisphere. Most of the oceans are in the Southern Hemisphere, they miss most of them entirely. Argo is a much more systematic way of measuring ocean temperature, and it's really quite good. There are about 3,000 or so buoys and floats that go around all the oceans, so they've got it all covered. Every few days, these robotic floats drop down to a couple of thousand metres, and they slowly go back to the surface, and then radio back the temperatures they recorded via satellite back to HQ. So, what are the Argo results? You've probably never heard of them. They're not made public. Why isn't there a website for them, just like there are for air temperatures? You can go to air temperature sites and every month they update to what the latest air temperature is, not ocean temperatures. The only way to get the data is to ask Josh Willis. Josh Willis is in Pasadena in California, and he runs the program. And the last couple of years he hasn't been getting up the data at all, ever since he accidentally gave it to a skeptic in 2008. That was the data. I haven't turned the graph upside down, that's cooling. So it's a scandal that these guys don't tell us what their Argo data is. Why is there no website? We paid for this data, or more particularly Jim did, because he's American. I think it's a joint effort, Jim, but you guys paid us. In science, you should share your data. In politics, you hide it. So if Argo did show warming, wouldn't it be publicised endlessly? And every communication channel in our society is absolutely saturated with warmist literature. How come they don't mention this? Good news, we can only conclude that Argo shows that the ocean temperatures are not going up. Alright, to make the next few points, I want to look at the temperature record for the last 2,000 years. So what I did was I got the best data from every period. From 1979 to now, I used satellites. From 1850 to 79, I used land thermometers. Before that, I used a reconstruction by Lowy, which was the first one to use no tree earrings, and in whichever reconstruction had the proxy calibrated directly to temperature in a peer-reviewed article. I'm not going to go into the details. Just to say it's one of the best, and it's been confirmed by another study about a month ago. The warmists hate this study, by the way. There's the temperature, going back to the birth of Jesus Christ. The green ring shows you the area that relies on land thermometers. I showed you the pictures earlier. You can take it for granted that's a little bit exaggerated, that rise there. The yellow area is the medieval warm period, which is, according to most studies, when I say most, I mean like about 400 of them, involving about 700 scientists, most of them come to the conclusion that the medieval warm period was probably a tad warmer than it is today. But what I want to draw your attention to is that blue area down the bottom there, which is the Little Ice Age. And I'm going to do a little chronology here. The Little Ice Age, you probably can't see it in that small scale on the graph, ended, or the ascent out of the Little Ice Age ended shortly before 1700. Now that's a very important date. The Little Ice Age, the bottom of the Little Ice Age, was a little before 1700. We'll get to that. The air temperature for the last 160 years, using the land thermometer record. A lot of people don't know this, but it doesn't go up monotonically. It goes warming, cooling, warming, cooling. Every 20 or 30 years it switches over. Well, guess what? We just had a warming period. We've probably got cooling for the next 20 or so years. Might be mild cooling, but it's probably cooling. Politically, that's going to put a lot of pressure on the chiefs in the Western climate establishment to somehow raise the temperatures. Alright, so we're going to have to use more aircraft, more buildings, put the thermometers closer to the air conditioners, whatever it takes.
They can do it.
That's right. So, now here's something else that they omit. How many of you have ever seen a graph comparing the human emissions of CO2 to temperature? Cause and effect. Human CO2 is what they allege is the cause. Temperatures are the effect. Well, it turns out the US Department of Energy, thank you Jim, has very conveniently made these figures available from 1751. They've got all the fossil fuel figures and cement production and gas flaring, which are the major causes of emissions. They emitted deforestation, but deforestation is small. It's mainly offset by reforestation and afforestation and new crops, and it was greatly accelerated by fossil fuels, so the rate of deforestation actually tends to roughly mimic the emissions of fossil fuels for other reasons. Most it introduces 10% of error. Now this is a graph you'd probably never have seen, but ought to be the most important graph in climate science, or at least in the political aspect about do carbon emissions cause global warming. There's temperature in the black line, and down there in the lower right, there's a green line. That's the graph of human emissions of CO2. Now, the Western Climate Establishment reckons that the green line causes the black line, which is just a little bit of a stretch, because remember the Little Ice Age depth was in before 1700, but human emissions of CO2 were negligible until 1850. I think if more people knew that, they'd take the whole scare a little bit less seriously. Because that, I think, is pretty definitive proof that human emissions of CO2 did not start the current global warming trend. The current global warming trend started 300 years ago and is still continuing, but we didn't start it. Nor, apparently, have we made it any worse. Here's the period from 1850 to the present. Again, the green line is the human emissions of CO2, and each warming period, remember it goes warm, cool, each warming period is going up at about the same rate. And our level of emissions don't seem to have affected the rate at which it is warming. Prima facie, that says our human emissions of CO2 don't really matter much. Theoretically, we know they must. But the question, notice how the warmists like to frame this as, does CO2 cause warming, yes or no? Do you believe in climate change, yes or no? The answers to those questions are respectively, yes, CO2 does cause warming. Every molecule of CO2 we put into the atmosphere warms the planet. The more appropriate question is, how much does it warm the planet? Right, you've got to reframe that question. If the amount of warming caused by our CO2 is negligible, it's not a problem. If we're all going to fry, it's a big problem. Big difference. How come they never compare those alleged cause and effect? It's never appeared in the media to my knowledge. When I show people that graph, they've never seen it before. And that comparison quickly destroys the idea that human CO2 is causing global warming. So, and another important point, less than 1% of human emissions to date were before 1850. 85% of them occurred in post-World War II industrialisation. It wasn't until after World War II that people really got into emitting CO2. Do you know that 25% of emissions have occurred since 1998? Remember Dr. Phil Jones, he said that there's been no statistical warming since 1995? So if we've pumped out a quarter of our emissions ever in the last 12 years and it hasn't caused any warming. Anyway, this caused, that comparison I showed you, which they don't make, actually caused a lot of problem for the establishment. Makes them look stupid, so they had to revise history. Just had a small bureaucratic problem. In Assessment Report 1 in 1990 and Assessment Report 2 in 1996, in both cases they dated the depth of the Little Ice Age at about 1650 or 1680. So again, before 1700. So what they had to do was create a version of history in which the temperature coincided with our human CO2 emissions. So they put the minimum at 1910, which is one of the boundaries between a warming and a cooling period, and they constructed the man's hockey stick. By 2006, that was widely known out in scientific circles outside the Western Climate Establishment as a fraud. Basically, it just picked out, amongst all the temperature proxies that Michael Mann fed into the thing, it had statistical processing software that just picked out the hockey-shaped ones and ignored the rest pretty much. It was really only bristlecone pines that really counted. The bristlecone pines are a very special sort of tree. They grow in extremely dry regions. They're water limited, not temperature limited. They really only respond to water and, would you believe, CO2 in the air. So they don't measure temperature at all. The US Congress got around to appointing a high-level commission to look into it, headed by Professor Wegman. What he had to say was that We found man's methods to be somewhat obscure and incomplete. Incomplete is a scientific word that means rubbish or BS. And the criticisms by their main critics to be valid and compelling. That was McKittrick and McIntyre from Climate Audit. And this is the second point that Wegman made, amongst many. The work has been sufficiently politicised that this community can hardly reassess their public positions without losing credibility. So they've dug their hole and they're sitting in it. What do other climate establishments say? The Western climate establishment isn't the only game around. The Chinese torpedoed the Copenhagen negotiations last year. January this year, they said that we need more research to establish whether warming is man-made. Then the bombshell, August 2010, 2 months ago, started appearing in Chinese state-sanctioned bookstores, a book called Low Carbon Plot, which completely rejects the theory of man-made global warming. I'll read you a poorly translated excerpt from there. With the increase in carbon dioxide will the increase in carbon dioxide definitely lead to the planet warming? Although there have been many reports published by research institutes that verify this, but from the viewpoint of the history of man and scientific method, the theories have not yet achieved scientific proof. The book argues that the theory of man-made global warming is a conspiracy between Western governments and business to protect their own way of life at the expense of the entire developing world. The Russians, well, they've always said it's rubbish. They've made that clear right from the very beginning. They reject the very idea that carbon dioxide had anything to do with it, and they reckon it's mainly due to solar cycles. The Indians, well, their record is that on their National Action Plan on Climate Change 2 years ago, they said, quote, no firm link between the documented climate changes below and warming due to anthropogenic climate change has yet been established. So the Chinese or Indians are saying, not enough proof, and the Russians dismiss it out of hand. Oh yes, and in February 2010, the Indian government set up its own body to monitor the effects of global warming because it, quote, cannot rely, unquote, on the ICCC. So there are only a few climate establishments around the world. They belong to the largest national emitters, which in order are China, the US, then Russia, then India. When I say that these climate establishments are independent, I mean that they're funded differently. So if you're part of the Western climate establishment, you work with joint projects and you might get funding from the US or the UK or maybe France or Germany. All the scientists sort of mixed around. They all share, to some extent, a common funding pool. But that doesn't mix with the Chinese or the Russians or the Indians. They're in their own climate establishments with their own funding sources. 3 out of 4 don't agree. Our media is fond of saying that almost all climate scientists agree with it. Well, no, only most Western climate science, the ones who share the Western funding source. So, most Western climate scientists believe global warming is man-made. Who thinks that's true? Who thinks it's false? Well, I'm sorry to disappoint you, they nearly all do think it's true. By and large, yes. There are qualifications on it and there's significant disagreement, but most in the sense of probably 60 or 70%, yeah, they do. That's true, but the reasons for it, probably not what you expect. Remember, I worked in the climate science establishment for a while, or sort of on the outskirts. I was one of these sort of outside experts dragged in to do particular jobs, and you can see what's going on. Basically what had happened was that the believers took over the bodies that fund Western science, and there are only a few of these, there's a couple in each country. The funding bodies were taken over by believers back in the late 1980s and early 1990s. They took 2 actions. Basically they fired skeptics, or just hindered their careers by not publishing or not funding them. Al Gore personally sacked a few while he was vice president. And they only hired people who believed in the theory. And that's been going on for 20 years. So you can imagine that the body of opinion within Western climate science is pretty homogenised by now. You fire the people who disagree, and you only hire people who agree. It's pretty simple. Consequently, every time that Bob or I or someone else stands up and has an argument with these people, they always have the authority position. We just look like some outsider. That's because all the climate science authority positions are filled by believers. And it's not going to change. So if you're looking for a political strategy to defeat these guys, you're not going to find experts, well-credentialed, who are members of some climate science body, or even climate scientists at all, to agree with you. You're going to have to find another way. There's simply no corrective mechanism that exists within government-funded climate science. There's no competition from private bodies because no private body wants to research climate science. There's no auditing. There's no regulation. There's not even, like in Parliament, an organised and funded opposition to criticise and champion alternatives. As Joanne and I will verify, and Bob, anyone who speaks out comes under severe peer pressure. Oh, sorry, that's a different point. If you're just someone from outside climate science, you get called names. But if you're a climate scientist and you speak out in any way, or you're connected with the climate industry, you come under a lot of peer pressure to keep quiet. So people within the Western climate science establishment are under peer pressure because it threatens the funding and careers of people around them. And we scientists have kids and mortgages too, and who's going to employ a sacked climate scientist? Increasingly, the opposition to the Western climate science is old or retired. Richard Linton, for instance, is approaching 70. The only climate scientists, official climate scientists who are sceptical are a few old blokes who basically refuse to budge. When climate scientists retire, they're then free to speak out because they're no longer dependent on the government money. For instance, Joanne Simpson was the first woman to receive a PhD in meteorology and has been called in some circles amongst the most preeminent scientists of the last 100 years. She worked in NASA, but in retirement said, "Since I am no longer affiliated with any organisation, nor receive any funding, I can speak quite frankly. As a scientist, I remain sceptical." Now I want to go to the heart of the matter, the real heart of climate science. So I'm going to step this up a grade, it's going to get a little more technical here. But at the end of it, there's a very simple trick, and you'll be amazed. Well, I was anyway. If you think about it very carefully, the argument for man-made warming, global warming, is as follows. It's got three links to this argument. The first one is that humans are raising CO2 levels. Sounds reasonable. The second one is that CO2 is a greenhouse gas, no doubt about that. So when we put more of it in the atmosphere, we get some increased surface temperatures. That's called direct warming. Again, I've got no argument with that. The third and final link in the global warming chain is the one that people don't know about very much out there in public land, and that is that the Earth responds to the direct warming. Okay, we put more CO2 in there, it warms up the surface, but then the Earth changes. If you warm up the surface of the ocean, there's going to be more evaporation. That evaporated water has to go somewhere. It does something. If it stays in the atmosphere, it's water vapor is greenhouse gas, so it causes more warming. If it becomes clouds, well, clouds reflect heat, so it causes cooling. What happens? These responses of the Earth to that initial direct warming are what's called feedbacks. And feedbacks is something that seems to spin people's brains out, so I'm not really going to go on about it, except to say that in all the models and the way that the theory works, it's the feedbacks that amplify the direct warming threefold. That is to say, 2/3 of the warming claimed by the establishment is due to feedbacks, and only 1/3 due to the initial CO2 effect. Now, a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. The first two links have ample evidence, and I don't seriously disagree with them, although I take a lot of caveats on point one. However, there is absolutely no evidence for the third link, and it provides 2/3 of the projected warming. Right? If you ever have to get into an argument with warmists, they will focus you on the first 2 points. Your job is to focus them on the third point. It's a reframing problem. Right? The media only focus on the first 2 points. Most people only heard about the first 2 links. The third link is where the problem is. When skeptic scientists say there is no evidence, what we mean is there is no evidence for that amplifying feedback in point 3. Again, if their case is so strong, why do they frame it like this? Why obscure it? That question of feedbacks is the critical question in climate science. There's an empirical test. We can express it as the way the atmosphere warms. The climate models all predict a hotspot, a strong warming in the atmosphere over the tropics at about 12 kilometres as the atmosphere warms due to global warming. The hotspot is the amplifying feedbacks in action. It's due to an accumulation of water vapour coming off the oceans. It increases the depth of the atmosphere, it increases the amount of warming down here on the surface. In their models. This is what they predict. Each one of these diagrams goes from, there's 6 of them, they go each for a different cause, and each diagram on your left hand side goes from about 75 degrees north to about 75 degrees south. The equator's in the middle. The goes up to about 30 kilometres, the scale's on the right-hand side of each graph. The one in the upper left, marked A, is what they reckon happens when you inject greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. There are various other causes. What I want to focus your attention to is the last one. That's what the climate scientists' predictions, all the models roughly say something like that happened over the period, the last warming period. Fortunately, we're observing the atmosphere in the last warming period with radio science. These are weather balloons, you send them up, they radio back the temperature as they ascend through the atmosphere. So we know roughly what the temperature was at all points in time and height during that period. These are the results. I compare them side by side. On the left we have observed, on the right we have climate models. There's a difference. One has a hotspot, the other one doesn't. That's why we're going about the missing hotspot. Remember, the hotspot yields 2/3 of the warming in the projections. I think if most policymakers were aware of that and aware of the strong credentials behind those diagrams, remember I'm pulling them out of the warmest literature, both of those diagrams come out of warmest literature at the highest levels, I think they might just have a few sceptic thoughts. You can only conclude from those diagrams of observe versus what the models say that the models are wrong. And that therefore, that amplifying feedback is not occurring. So global warming, whilst true, is being greatly exaggerated. So it's not that they're wrong entirely. When we emit carbon dioxide, we do warm the atmosphere. But they're greatly exaggerating how much. About 6-fold, by the way. I won't go into why, but it's about 6-fold. So when they say it's going to be 3 degrees warmer by the end of the century, think half a degree. So what was the establishment response to that? First of all, they ignored it for 10 years. Well, actually, more like 13 years. 2008, they got around to denying the data. That failed because the data was too credible. There's too much of it. Couldn't all be wrong. Third, now this is what I want to direct your attention to. In 2008, based on no new data at all, because you can only collect the data while it's warming, and we only had the radiosonde data, and you can't go back in time and collect more data. In 2008, they found the hotspot. Steve Sherwood at Yale University and now at New South Wales Climate Research Institute, Wales University, came up with this diagram. Hallelujah, they found the hotspot. Anyone see a problem? It's the old colour scale trick. You see, in his colour scale, red means it stays the same colour, same temperature. It's not warming at all. If you go back to the other ones, there you go. See, red means warming. Red means warming. And yellow's about a little bit of warming, and blue means cool. Right? You go to Steve Sherwood's graph. No. Pale red means exactly the same. So if there was no warming at all in the atmosphere, his whole graph would be pale red. On top of that, his warming isn't nearly enough. It's an order of magnitude too low. But it looked good, doesn't it? It looks good. So that was in the Journal of Climate by a bona fide Western climate scientist at top institutes. It's as simple as just changing the colour scale of fluid. Is that cheating? I mean, that should be scandal. That should be, if newspapers understood that, they should be dumbed down to the business. I mean, as a scientist, I'm affronted. If people getting paid $200,000 a year to do that sort of stuff and getting millions of dollars of grants from Australian taxpayers now, it used to be US taxpayers, moved from Yale to New South Wales Uni, to come up with that rubbish. What possible purpose could that colour scale serve other than to mislead? It's deceptive. They're trying to hide something. I mean, listen, I missed something. There can't be any other explanation. Okay, I just want to wrap up with Al Gore's convenient lie, because that's always some people don't know this, and it matters, because a lot of people out there still Gore's moving and don't realise that he pulled a bit of the Swifty on them. Al Gore demonstrated that in the ice cores, CO2 and temperature move in lockstep, highly correlated. Obviously, one's causing the other. But what Gore admitted to say was that the changes in temperature happen 800 years on average before the corresponding changes in CO2. So the temperature changes cause the CO2 changes. Now, the point I want to make is that that scientific result was well known and beyond beyond argument by about 2003. It had been thrashed out for about 5 years before that, starting about 98. The Gore's movie was made in 2005, and he introduces that topic with a whole bunch of weasel words. He knew he was lying, by omission. Mr. Gore owns and runs companies involved in curbing carbon emissions. His net worth after his failed presidential run in 2000 was about $2 million. It's now approaching $1,000 million. Could be coincidence. Why don't the climate establishment or the media publicly correct Gore's lies? They kept mum about it. Doesn't this show that the climate establishment and the media are playing politics rather than being involved in a disinterested search for truth and good policy? So the obvious cheating of the Western climate establishment strongly suggests they are hiding something, and thus that their case is weak, or they are wrong. And the fact that they're cheating so blatantly and no one knows about it tells you the media haven't put them under any scrutiny. So just to recap, bit of car park warming, that's how they get their temperatures. It's got no relation with human CO2 because the global warming trend started well before we started emitting any decent quantity of CO2. Doesn't seem to affect the rate of warming. The theoretical hotspots on which they rely just don't exist. They keep the ocean data hidden from us, and they measure temperature like that. Can you trust these guys? Now, I've got a paper that goes through all that and some more, and is fully referenced, and so it'll be up on the web in a week or two. I'm going to give it a lot of publicity. What I'd like all of you to do is, if you think it's a good idea, just pick out some of those photographs and email them to your friends. I'll put up a bunch of sample emails that you might try, but show me a few words. Once people get the idea that they measure they measure temperature by putting their thermometers near air conditioners, it's going to kill their credibility. As a scientist, I've been playing nice for the last few years, and discussing wherever I could, whenever I'm given an opportunity to talk about hotspot and all those sort of things, nice genteel terms and so on. Well, I'm sick of it. They're cheating. They should be called to account for it. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that presentation. We have about 15 minutes for Q&A. So I'm sure there are many questions in the audience for David. Start right